So I'll dive in, and I'll dive in a little bit extemporaneously, but then kind of I'll come back to a slideshow and try and stay on track. And Jason, a little heads up, this should take me about 23 minutes. If it takes a whole lot more, shut me up.
You're all good. We're good on time. Just let me know when you want me to launch the keynote.
Okay. In any case, when GAC was forming, it occurred to me even then that Buffalo Bill Days was an interesting potential topic for us to discuss. It is the biggest celebration that goes on in town every year, as probably you all know. And yet it's an issue where it's more of a carnival than a time to reflect on who this guy was, who was indeed part of this community, albeit in death up on top of Lookout Mountain. So with that, let's go to the slides. So the question I began asking myself is, does Buffalo Bill deserve celebration? That's our topic. Next slide. And again, before diving into the content here, I've had a lot of help assembling the information that I have. You saw my little biography. I am not a professional historian, and I guess my presentation will drive that point home over the next 20 minutes or so. But historian Patty Limerick, who probably many of you have heard speak or know of, was an initial source of guidance for us. The primary text that I relied on is a fascinating book called Buffalo Bills America, William Cody and the Wild West by Lewis Warren, who's a professor of history at UC Davis, I believe. And based on that, I would suggest for that book/media club a PBS American Experience documentary called Buffalo Bill was produced some time ago. Patty Limerick is featured in that, and it's based on the book, albeit that it doesn't go into nearly as much depth. In recent weeks, I've been working with Shannon Dennison, who's essentially the person in charge of the Buffalo Bill Museum. She's only been in that role a short time. I don't know how many of you have ever visited it. I only visited for the first time and just briefly last week. The place is fascinating, but it needs a lot of work, and Shannon is undertaking that. And the story that is told there will presumably in years ahead morph somewhat from the adventurous tall tale that most of us know about Buffalo Bill into a more truthful and thoughtful examination of his life. And then I also want to thank Joy Bauman, who is the president of Buffalo Bill Days. I had known her very briefly outside of the context of this from previously, and I thought she would be aghast at the idea of questioning the event and the premise for the celebration. But she has been, in fact, very open and receptive to learning more and cooperating going forward. And I thank her and her board and members for that as well. And I should probably mention just at this point too, you know, that Buffalo Bill Days was canceled last year, and it is in fact, sadly, canceled again this summer. But to give you a little bit of foresight into where I'm headed with all my thoughts about this, I hope it does return perhaps in a little bit different light, but I hope very much it returns bigger and better than ever next year. Next slide. So Buffalo, I'll just by way of introduction of what Buffalo Bill Days in Golden is about, before I get into Buffalo Bill himself, it's been a celebration here in Golden since the 1950s. It began with trail rides to the top of Lookout Mountain to visit Buffalo Bill's grave, and the community embraced the celebration. And it is what has become over the years. It brings a lot of people and attention to the community. As much as it is a big deal in the community and a lively event, to say the very least, I think it's fair to say that it has never been presented with a careful, introspective examination of Buffalo Bill from a historical perspective. And it's more a good excuse to go have some fun and drink some beer, and there's nothing wrong with that. But events in our recent past, nationally and otherwise, have reminded us that systemic racism runs throughout our history. And that includes the opening of the American West to settlers during Buffalo Bill's lifetime in 1846, from 1846 to 1917. Just a little context there. Born just before the Civil War and lived until the culmination of World War I. So certainly a tumultuous segment of American history. And really what I'm going to try and get into here is that what happened during that period, particularly in the American West, to what extent was Buffalo Bill just a kind of a symbol of, and to what extent did he actually drive the perception that we all have of the American West? Next slide. So he was indeed a big deal. If the question of whether we should have a celebration were simply to turn on how prominent a guy he was, well, we better have a big party, because he may well have been the most famous man in the world during the heyday of his career. Give you one statistic to back that up. One summer, the Wild West show played primarily in New York City and drew more than 3 million visitors in a city that probably would have been its entire population at the time. As a showman, Buffalo Bill helped create the image and legacy of the American West. And that image and his persona is a blend of fact and fiction that really does deserve to be questioned. Probably the most critical single event in his lifetime, and by critical, I mean as in deserves criticism, is while he was an Army scout, he killed and scalped a Cheyenne warrior by the name of Yellow Hand. And he did so arguably, and I'll get into this, more as a publicity stunt than a necessary act of war. But by later in his life, he also, particularly during and following his years in the Wild West show, he exhibited considerable sympathy and compassion for the Indian people. And as it turns out, he was also a strong advocate for women's rights. I don't go into it in more depth here, but he's the one that brought Annie Oakley to the Wild West show. She was very much a new image for women, and he was also an active advocate for women's suffrage. Next slide. Okay. Without going into all the many fascinating aspects of his life, I'm going to highlight 3 particular issues or incidents that I would ask each of you to think about in terms of going back to our original question of, does Buffalo Bill deserve celebrating? The first is the scalping of yellow hair, which I mentioned already. The second is the story of the Wild West show. As I'll go into, the Wild West show wasn't just an entertainment. It had a story to tell, and whether that story was accurate and appropriate is questionable. And then finally, we should question Buffalo Bill's relationship with the Indians. And I should say, for those of you that perhaps slept through your U.S. history class, Buffalo Bill and William Cody are indeed one and the same. That's the stage name he adopted pretty early in his life and career. It is, I guess I would draw a reference to Lady Gaga. She's got a real name too, but I can't remember what it is. Buffalo Bill seems to stick. Anyway, let's go to the next slide. Just a little bit of history to begin to create some context. Cody was born in Iowa, but at a very young age moved with his family to Leavenworth, Kansas. And Kansas at the time, I believe still a territory, there was a lively debate as to whether it would be a slave state or a free state. And this is still prior to the Civil War. And his father was a very active advocate for abolition and for Kansas being a free state. He was murdered as a result for his beliefs. At this point, Cody was 11 years old, and he basically became the family's breadwinner. As ridiculous as that sounds, it's true. And he took on odd jobs on a full-time basis from that point forward, never had any further schooling. And I guess the rest is history. By age 14, he may or he may not have been a rider for the Pony Express. And I mention this because A, it's part of his mystique, and B, it is maybe the first major event in his lifetime where fact and fiction become extremely blurred. I could present a whole evening's recitation on did he or did he not ride for the Pony Express. But frankly, the point is that tall tales were a part of who he was. Next slide. He did serve briefly in the Civil War. Nothing major to say about that as a Union soldier. But after the war, the West became a focus of the nation's growth. First of all, the Army didn't have a job anymore, so they had to advocate in Congress, just like today's lobbyists do, for a budget. And their main thing to advocate for was we'll go fight the Indians. The settlers, of course, were all for that because they wanted the land, and as often as not, the Army ended up protecting the Indians from the settlers, not just vice versa. But in any event, Cody became a buffalo hunter for a couple of years in the late 1860s, whose job was to provide meat for the railroad workers. Buffalo at the time on the plains still numbered in the millions, if not tens of millions. And there was little thought at that point on his or anybody else's part that they would ever be gone. So I didn't list buffalo hunting as one of our critical issues. The thought that I had in my head when I started this project that what Buffalo Bill was about was killing the buffalo so that in turn the Indians would be decimated just isn't true. But as it turns out, the decimation of the buffalo did play a huge part in the decline of the Indians. Not only did they not have a source of food, but it dispersed them such that without huge herds to chase, they couldn't live in large groups, and those large groups were their best defense against the cavalry and the settlers. Next slide. After his stint as a buffalo hunter, having shown his prowess as a hunter and having learned the lay of the land, so to speak, he became an Army scout. Army scouts at the time were not soldiers. They were private contractors working for the Army, but they could come and go, take assignments as they chose, and that suited Cody well. He was employed as a scout and continued as a scout until sometime after he'd actually entered show business, and I'll come back to that. The interesting thing about his scouting is that most Army scouts were either Indians themselves, particularly Pawnee, or people of mixed race, or the offspring of early trappers, white men who had Indian families. And Cody stood out from them. He was a white guy, and he had more of a relationship with the largely Anglo-Saxon officers of the Army, and he was kind of a go-between between them and the rank and file scouts who were Indian or otherwise. He wasn't necessarily the most skilled scout, but he was a good go-between, and because he was white, he rose to a greater prominence. During his time as a scout, there was a series of Indian raids in western Kansas by a Cheyenne chief by the name of Tall Bull. There were Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other Indians under his leadership, basically attacking settlements. And they were, in fact, guilty of some pretty heinous crimes. Tall Bull and his band kidnapped a couple of German immigrant women, along with one of their babies, subsequently brutally murdered the baby. The cavalry was sent out, and as it turns out, at the Battle of Summit Springs, Cody killed Tall Bull. Again, I don't have this on my major list of issues because he was acting in the capacity that probably we would expect a soldier or scout to act, and in effect, in a somewhat defensive action, despite the fact that the settlers were there stealing Indian lands, if we briefly set that off. So Cody became extremely good during his, not only extremely good, the best during his show business career at portraying these events of his life, some real, some made up. And here's a poster of him killing Tall Bull. You'll notice that the horse is bigger than the horse on top of Mile High Stadium, and Tall Bull's about 10 times as big as Buffalo Bill too. And I guess that would be a little bit of poetic license. Next slide. So remember that I mentioned Lewis Warren's book about Buffalo Bill, and a large part of that builds out the thesis of Buffalo Bill having been the iconic white Indian. And what he meant by that is that Americans then and Americans today at least at one level, held the Indians at with great respect. They were exciting. They were adventurous. They were the what we came to know as the noble savage. And Cody had all of their trappings. He dressed the part. This is how he dressed when he went to the grocery store. This wasn't his stage costume. This was Buffalo Bill. I've seen 1,000 pictures of him now, and this is about as dressed down as he ever gets. And this image was who he became, and it became an especially attractive image to white Americans because he was safer to look at and admire as a representative of the Wild West than a real live Indian would be. Next page. So how do you go from being a scout out on the plains with very few people around and so forth to being a world-class entertainer? Well, Cody was born a showman, but the pieces fell readily into place. The stuff that he was doing was exciting. It was a story that the Americans, people, particularly back east, wanted to know about what was going on in the West. He was a great storyteller. So people would, wealthy Easterners would take the train out to Kansas, essentially to as far as it went at the time, hop off the train, and expect to find somebody that would take them out to see and hunt the buffalo. And Cody was more than happy to play that role. He and a number of others became sort of the prominent folks that did this stuff, and they could actually make a living by doing that, going back to the railroad station, waiting for the next train to show up, and there he was. So he'd take people out buffalo hunting, and then of course around the campfire he had a chance to tell stories, and he was a good storyteller, some true, some not true, many true but not of him. He would tell tales of the American West and place him in the action where actually he wasn't there. That attention also brought writers to the West, and the distinction between journalists and fiction writers and so forth was more blurry in the day. There were what were called dime novels, and dime novelists were always looking for a good story to tell. They take the train out, they meet Buffalo Bill, they write a wild and crazy story that he's more than happy to participate in embellishing, and that's where he begins to become famous. And at one point, he figures that along with these writers, that he can go back east and tell the stories on a stage. And he begins doing that in 1872. And as it turns out, he was good at it. He wasn't a professional actor by any means, but that was an appealing part of things to his audience. He was authentic, quote, and he spent several years where in the wintertime, when it was not time to go scouting and hunting, he would go to New York and other big Eastern cities and put on stage presentations and draw enormous crowds. And in the summer, he'd go back out west and have some more adventures and have some new stories to tell the next year. So that's how his stage career began. But by 1883, he had outgrown that form of entertainment. He had other people on stage with him, maybe doing shooting exhibitions, etc. And it's not hard to figure that a shooting exhibition inside of a theater pretty quickly outgrows the space. So he founded the Wild West Show in 1883, and it was wildly successful. He wasn't always wildly successful as a businessman, but the show itself was. And it toured the United States and Europe before Kings and Queens, and every spectacular superlative you can think of can be thrown at that. It really became a world-renowned show. And I'm going to skip this last bullet, and we'll go on to the next slide. So, having begun his entertainments, but still acting as a scout, we come to the summer of 1876. You might remember that that's when August 1st, 1876 is when Colorado became a state. Also, in May of 1876, I think it was, could have been June, I have screwed that up, was when Custer met his end at the Little Bighorn. And I'm going to read this paragraph here just word for word rather than trying to elaborate on it at all. Never was his prowess at fusing life and art greater than in the summer of 1876 when he took leave from the stage to scout for the Army. Weeks into the campaign, he learned that General George Armstrong Custer and most of his command had fallen before the Sioux and Cheyenne on the banks of the Little Bighorn River. Soon thereafter, dressed in a black velvet stage costume, he swooped into a skirmish with a Cheyenne war party, killing and scalping a Cheyenne sub-chief named Yellow Hair. Within months, Cody was reenacting the episode in a play he commissioned, taking this first scalp for Custer before packed houses from New York to St. Louis, wearing the same stage costume that he had killed Yellow Hair in, and waving the real scalp at the drama's climax. And he continued to do that. Yellow Hair's scalp was a stage prop for him for the rest of his life. So that he would actually, I mean, you saw the buckskin outfit. I don't have a picture in here, and I don't think there is a color picture here of this black velvet stage costume. It's like what you see when you go to to a rodeo, to the National Western Stock Show or whatever. It is not what cowboys wear when they go out to brand cattle. By the time he had scalped Custer, by the next day, he had his journalist contacts broadcasting this around the world. It was a stunt of all stunts. And it was not a major battle by any means. It was, he knew at this point that he just needed to go out and find an Indian and kill and scalp him to put on a show and make a statement, in effect, in defense of General Custer. So, next slide. There's another view of what took place then and what took place thereafter. Historian Paul Hedren, who worked for many years for the National Park Service, writes of Cody in his later years, killing and scalping Indians had become loathsome to Buffalo Bill. Over the years, writes Hedren, Cody himself expressed ambiguity about his act. He was concerned about how the scalping might be portrayed, and he told a correspondent that Yellow Hair was the only Indian I ever scalped. I did not believe in scalping. Why the change of heart? Perhaps it was a product of his fame himself. Native Americans featured heavily in his show, and the relationships they had built together forced him to reconsider his act. So he did reconsider, perhaps, but he also continued to use that scalp as a prop. And by the way, even in its time, there were people actively opposed to scalping. It wasn't an accepted act of war among everyone. And particularly in New England, he had to sort of keep the scalping under wraps when he performed there. Next slide. Let me talk a little bit about the Wild West show itself. It was a spectacle. It was huge. The exhibition area that he would set up in a city to put the show on was enormous. They would actually literally build a mountain range at one end of the arena as a backdrop for the thing. Hundreds and hundreds of show people were involved. And many attribute to him. He didn't invent the phrase, but in effect, he, along with P.T. Barnum, invented show business. Next slide. But it was more than just an entertainment. What he portrayed throughout the many years of the Wild West show, it would be a series of scenes, but the underlying story was the drama of civilization, a small topic. And the civilization that he portrayed was one of white culture and white supremacy. The mythical history most of us learned in school involving the inevitable domination and expansion of white culture, the family farm, Christianity, as the United States grew west across the continent. And by then, by white here, we're actually referring to the Anglo-Saxon colonists and their descendants, these being not only the prominent leaders of the country, but of the army. And other Europeans were not particularly regarded as white at the time. And that conflict between immigrants and the whites that were already here was a prominent part of the show. So in this myth, Indians were regarded as noble savages, but they were simply in the way. Their culture was doomed, and they would either need to assimilate or die. And that was the story of the Wild West show. Next slide. This is a hard one to see, I know, and it's also a little hard to explain, but I'll do my best. The last scene of the Wild West show for most of its 30 some odd years was called The Attack on the Settler's Cabin. And I'll read this caption. The finale of the Wild West show for most of its years, a symbol of white family defense against threats to domestic order and femininity. Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show program, 1885. Everything else in the show led up to this, but it was really a defense of our conquest of the continents. Indians be damned. So next slide. Okay. Buffalo Bill's relationship with the Indians is anything but simple. Remember, as a scout, he worked with Indians, mostly Pawnee, to fight Indians, mostly Sioux and Cheyenne. As a showman, Indian participation was essential to his success. The first year or two, he didn't include Indians, but he quickly recognized that they added to the authenticity, to the attraction of the spectacle, and he embraced that and ended up treating Indians very well to, first of all, to encourage them to participate and to come back year after year rather than, training a new bunch of actors in his show. And, they were treated well in terms of being well fed, well clothed, even well paid. Interesting point of contention here among historians. Some historians will say that he paid Indians the same that he paid white and other cowboys. Others say, well, not quite. He paid them a heck of a lot better than he would have paid people than they could have earned back home on the reservation or elsewhere in society, but he didn't pay them as much as whites. Over the years, that enabled him to develop many lasting relationships and friendships with Indians. I could go into considerable detail here if we had the time. Probably his most famous Indian participant was Sitting Bull, who he honored in the show by not actually having him be a performer, but simply someone who was there and who would come out and everybody would applaud and so forth, even though he was the one that had killed General Custer. And we can only speculate about how his views really changed over the years. Next slide. And actually, my last slide. This ends more with a question than with a firm conclusion. But again, I'm going to turn to Warren and quote, the real question that less becomes how Cody derived his sympathies for the Indians than how he fashioned a persona of Buffalo Bill that could denounce Indian conquest at one moment and become its most visible advocate at the next. Of all Cody's characteristics, it is this profound ambivalence about Indians that seems the most impenetrable. And that is my presentation. Happy to share these slides and recommend you're looking at any of these sources. I also recommend going up and visiting Buffalo Bill's grave when you have a museum, when you have a chance. But I'll turn it back to Jason and the others and be happy to answer some of your questions.
And thank you so much. If we could just all unmute again and thank Ken collectively. I really appreciate that. That was super informative. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We will open it up for Q&A here. And